So this next session is about the types of contribution, and there are, we recognize contributors who do all sorts of things, and there are some things that you can do very casually as somebody who doesn't come necessarily to Egeria very often, and Nigel's comment about even raising bugs and providing feedback is very valuable to a community. So that is a contribution, and it can be around your initial experiences or some very deep some very deep experiences around it. So we see feedback as an important part of the contribution, which anyone can do. The next sort of thing that you could learn to do is around test cases and bug fixes. Then we can start thinking about blog posts and documentation, and I make them blue because you actually need to know about Egeria to do this. So you need to have some level of skill in Egeria to provide that context around these types of contributions. And we're going to talk about connectors in a second. Then we've got the things that are colored red and black, and these are things that require deeper knowledge of Egeria. And the reason is that let me go navigate through and show you. I'm going to look at a file called status and roadmap. That's this file here. The way that the code is structured is that in the base, this developer platform, this is where most of the code sits, and this is what makes the OMAG server platform that you were running yesterday. That's where that sits. That environment has a lot of plug points in it, and those plug points are called connectors. And that is what allows us to work with lots of different technologies. So basically the standard method for plugging in third-party technology is through a connector. And those connectors sit in the layer above. And there are also utilities and sort of more technical API, some more technical user interfaces that sit there. And then above that are the sort of business solutions around this global metadata that we're creating. So this picture here shows the different components. And effectively, the deeper you are in this stack, the more stuff that's sitting above you. And so to make a change to an API or to make a change to a framework, particularly because the consumers of that are not all in our build. So even if you make a change and make the Egeria build, you might break something else. So the need for backward compatibility, the need for understanding a much broader set of users is important when you're changing the frameworks. Then when you start to change the platform or the services on top, your knowledge, so the platform, you need to know intimately how the OMAG server platform is working. So you need deep knowledge of Egeria itself. And then to build the services on top, the repository services should, in many respects, from a difficulty point of view, should sit in the platform, because that is the communication mechanism across the cohort. It is released software, and we have products relying on it not changing at all from release to release. So that's a very tightly controlled piece of code. And then the access services, governance services, and view services, each are on their own life cycle in terms of their maturity. And they are pillars that sit on top of the repository services. So they work with a particular community. So in order to change any of those, you need to be collaborating with that community. So that's that bottom piece. The open types, again, you're thinking about the broader ecosystem of metadata. So you need to think about metadata across many different types of tools. So it almost needs a sort of broader architect, solution architect, enterprise architect type thinking to do those changes. So that's why things that sit in that developer platform are I've got marked as red and black. basically, because of the context that you need to understand in order to safely make changes there. And then the layer above is the plug-in point. And so connectors, you need to know about our connector framework, which is quite simple, but you really need to know how a third-party technology works. So your knowledge is largely focused on the third-party technology you're plugging into Egeria, and not so much about Egeria itself. It's very quick to learn how a connector is working. It's about 2 or 3 methods you need to implement. So that's the connector. And then we have utilities for third parties. So that's using our clients. So again, your knowledge is more about the content that you're producing and the integration there, and the client interface you're calling, as opposed to how the runtime works. So it's a slightly simpler thing to do. The UI piece, everything that the UI uses is obviously using our REST APIs. So your skill level really is around UIs, about the building of the UI, how UIs work. So that's your skill, as opposed to having specific skill in Egeria. So that's really where this integration UI is. And then when we come to the governance solutions, they are, your skill really is about, solving that business problem. That's because these are very high level things. And then your knowledge of Egeria that's needed underneath is the APIs. It's breadth rather than depth. So typically a solution will involve connectors, third-party utilities, UI integration across, and using multiple levels of services, from the view services, governance service, and access services, because what you're doing is putting together a collection of integrated servers, plus a user interface, plus content to create that solution. So it's not, as I say, it's not deep, it's broad information and more broad knowledge that's required to work at this higher level. So does that make sense when it comes to the sorts of things you can work through? So for example, you might be doing bug fixing in one of these lower modules, but if you're doing, well, okay, I can see that piece of code's not checking for null and could create a null pointer exception, then you don't need to know too much about that module to make that change. It's a fairly localized, safe change. But if you wanted to change the behavior, the flow structure of a method in that layer, you need to know an awful lot more. So that's why that chart shows different colors for the different types of contribution. Any comments or feedback, or what have I forgotten to say by any other members of the team? Okay, so there's another thing I want to show you, which is the developer guide. That's it. So the developer guide is for developers that are wanting to plug into Egeria. So this is people building the utilities and building connectors. So it's people working in the integration layer. And this guide has this information about how to build a connector. And really there are 2 uses of the connector framework. One of them is to build a connector that plugs into Egeria. So that connector implements the Open Connector Framework. That's what OCF stands for. The interfaces, which is the interface that allows us to initialize, start, and stop the connector. And then each type of connector has its own specialist interface. And some of those is just one method, which provides additional piece of information. Others, so the repository interface, for example, so if you want to plug a new type of metadata repository into the repository services, there are about 40 functions that you need to provide. So it's a much bigger interface and a bigger piece of work. We think 6 months to build one of those. Whereas many other connectors, it might just be a couple of weeks work. So they do vary based on type. And so the interface for the connector is determined by Egeria. There are other types of connectors that are for third-party environments. And so they're clients that combine access to a particular data source or service plus access to Egeria metadata. So what you're doing is you're building something that applications can consume that are combining that notion that you should be able to access the metadata with the data. So if we remember on day one, when we look at a photo, we see the photo and we see the metadata. So the design of these application connectors are designed to do exactly that, to allow data and metadata to be seen, to be accessed directly. And these connectors call Egeria to pull the metadata, and obviously call the actual real source of data as well. And so they provide this combined API where you can see those. Not necessary for something like photos because they already have both, although the Egeria connection would give you an awful lot more information about that photo. So maybe there is a reason for doing that. But it's typically for business information that does not, the business data that does not have that rich metadata capability. So that's the two types of connectors that you can build. And the developer guide basically takes you through the 3 methods you need to implement to be a connector. That makes you a connector. And then the little bit about implementation, and then this is the list of all the different types of connectors that we have in Egeria, and the owner of which module owns the module, owns that connector interface. And typically that interface is located in let me see, the interface for the connectors. There's 2 patterns in use here. There's one pattern where the description of the connectors is in the API module. So this is repository services, and there's a set of packages for all the different types of connectors that the repository service supports. And in fact, there's a lot, because repository services supports the archive, the audit log, the cohort registry, which is where we keep information about the other members of the cohort, and the metadata store. And for example, this is the interface of a connector that is a repository connector. And if I zip through to the bottom, you can see it's a very big interface covering simple and complex things. But each implementation can implement a subset of it, and then we have a base class that will do the default implementation for most of the methods. So that's one pattern, which is that the connector APIs are in the API module. And the other pattern is, let me think where that occurs, Discovery Engine maybe, yes, is that some modules have a separate module that is just the connector interface. And this is important where the API can be used independently of the connectors. So here we've got some connectors for the in and the out topic. So this is the asynchronous interface for this module, which is separate from the API, which you can use independently. So that's why they've been split. So there are those 2 different styles if you're looking for the interfaces either in the API or in a connector, specialized connector module. So that is a little bit about the different types of contributions that that we support in Egeria. Any questions on this?